Well, good afternoon, everyone. And what we have now is what will be the final lecture in this class as we prepare for the presentation that the students are going to be giving to the United Nations World Civic Forum in Seoul, Korea by video conference in just a couple of weeks. But before doing that, we wanted to finish. Last week we looked at a bit of what was going on in Europe, and today the focus is on Asia. And we have a special guest lecturer from Kyunghee University who is going to be making a presentation from the campus there, and we'll have an introduction to that speaker as we go a little bit further on into this session here today. But before that, I wanted to do two things. The first was to talk a little bit about some of the recent changes and what the Obama administration is working on, which is a way of setting up the very big discussions that will be going on not only at the World Civic Forum, but also in Copenhagen. And then second, looking a little bit about some of the issues that are happening in Asia as well. Those policies, puzzles, and issues are absolutely huge in ways that these things are shaping up. Now, earlier in this class, we talked about the Obama administration's consideration of an endangerment finding. That is, finding that climate change, and especially carbon dioxide gases, create an endangerment to the public health and welfare. This is the kind of thing that only makes lawyers happy when you start talking about it. When you say that the Obama administration is considering making a finding of endangerment on greenhouse gases, the usual response is, boy, that sounds awfully boring. But the reality is the following. The reality is that what the administration has done, because the administration made that final and official finding last Friday, starting off a process of creating a comment period before issuing a final ruling on this in a couple of months. What the administration did in this process was to kick off a very complex set of processes. First, it made the process of looking at climate change a major and indeed inescapable part of its policies. Instead of debating, well, we're not sure whether climate change is real, well, we're not sure whether we're going to take action, well, we're not sure what action we're going to take, the administration made a formal scientific finding, subject now to negotiation and to debate and to discussion, about whether or not greenhouse gases, in fact, constitute a threat to the public health and welfare. By making that finding, the administration is now obligated to having the United States respond. It would be the equivalent to discovering that there was something in my Diet Pepsi here that might threaten me, and the administration would be then required to find ways of making it safe. It would be the equivalent of discovering that there was something that was unsafe in the computers that the students here are using in front of me that would require the administration to take an action to make those products safe. By making the finding, the administration commits itself and the United States to remedying that danger that greenhouse gases present. So, in this long debate that we've had in the United States over greenhouse gases, and this long debate about whether or not the United States ought to take action, this finding of endangerment, this seemingly arcane, abstract finding of scientific fact, has profound policy implications, because what it does is to create, first, the grounds for establishing the scientific base for climate change policy. Secondly, by creating the scientific base, it creates a commitment to a policy response. So for a long time, when there was a debate, is it real, is it not, it creates that scientific finding. And secondly, we're not sure whether or not we're going to do something. It creates the commitment to doing something. Those two steps come directly out of this very arcane process that we call the endangerment finding that, in fact, the Environmental Protection Agency announced last week. Now, the question now is, what is it that's going to happen? And as I note on the slide here, there are two obvious things. One is that the Environmental Protection Agency itself could take action and may take action and policy change in response to that. What some of the betting is that interest groups all across the political planet in the United States will take one look at the possible consequences of a finding of endangerment and say, whoa, wait a minute, this is just way too much, way too scary, way too crazy. At the very least, we need Congress to try to put some limits and try to structure and focus the effort, so that there are those who say, at the very least, what it does is create an incentive for Congress itself to get involved in a fundamental way. Because it is conceivable that with endangerment as a finding and with EPA committed to act, EPA now required to act, that the limits on EPA's action may in fact be no limits at all. There may be an enormous realm of possibility of what it is that EPA could do. And a lot of interest groups are going to take one look at that and say, we can't allow that to happen. What it may do then is to create an impetus for congressional action, which many suspect is precisely what the Obama administration has in mind. One way or another, it appears likely that something is going to happen. The questions are, what is it that will happen, and who is it in the United States government who will take action? And the options include a full range of policy actions that could include a fundamental set of rulings on what kind of cars people can drive, to much more limited actions on the way in which power gets created and generated in this country. And it could be Environmental Protection Agency regulations extending all the way to an act of Congress. Make no mistake about it, this, however, is a very big deal. And it's something that fundamentally has, in the course of just within the first 100 days of the Obama administration, created a dramatic shift from previous climate change policy in the United States. It has, not surprisingly, produced a lot of very interesting reactions from other parts of the world, and other parts of the political world, that is. First, from the Natural Resources Defense Council, one of their officials has said, the Environmental Protection Agency is able to focus on the big stuff, the big sources of global warming pollution, and the two biggest are motor vehicles and power plants. So there's nothing to the scare stories that don't convince the court, the Supreme Court, and shouldn't convince anyone else. This is going to go beyond the big central sources. So what they're saying is, you know what, this is a big deal, but it's not like the Environmental Protection Agency is kicking the door open to everything, that what EPA is going to do is focus on the big polluters. The big polluters are cars and power plants, and any effort to try to deal with endangerment is going to focus necessarily on that. That, however, doesn't convince some people in business. This from the Chamber of Commerce. Bill Kovacs, who's from their Governmental Relations Department, says the EPA, therefore, has a choice to make. It can proceed at a place that's consistent with current and future technology, or it can allow non-governmental entities, not to mention the Natural Resources Defense Council, can allow non-governmental entities and activist groups to take the regulations out of EPA's hands and apply the Clean Air Act through the courts. The second option would kill economic growth and jobs. What they're worried about is that if you allow the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate, where is it going to stop? And if it's not clear where it ought to stop, we have some environmental interest groups that are going to try to push it as far as possible. And pushing as far as possible is going to end up pushing a lot of these questions into the courts, which could create enormous amounts of political battles and the potential for long delays. In short, who knows where this is going to go? And so that's what the administration, I suspect, is betting on. It'll push this back into a mandate for congressional action. But for better or worse, some might call it an engineered car wreck. Some might call it a very deliberate strategy toward policy change. Some may at least use it as a way to put real teeth in the Environmental Protection Agency. This is a very big deal that involves all three branches of American government. The executive branch, form of the President and the Environmental Protection Agency, the legislative branch in the face of Congress, and the judicial branch in the role that the courts inevitably are going to have to play for sorting out the battles that exist between them. This is, in short, a very big, very significant, very important step that's underway. We'll be returning to Dr. Lee, who's going to be our guest lecturer in just a few moments. But before doing that, what I want to do in preparation for the World Civic Forum is spend a few moments talking about climate change issues as they affect Asia. As you listen to the lecture, there'll be some things in particular that you'll want to try to focus on. The issue of climate change in Asia is a bit different than in other parts of the world. As we've discovered already, when we start talking about climate change, while there's one world, one globe, one atmosphere affected by issues of climate change and by greenhouse gases, the effects vary tremendously from country to country, and the causes vary tremendously as well. And as we look carefully at the issues in Asia, one of the issues is how is it that the issues of climate change affect Asia in particular? We saw a lot of that debate back at the beginning stages of preparations for the Olympics, where there are a lot of Olympic athletes who were worried, do we dare go to Beijing in advance? Do we dare go to Beijing and breathe the air? Do we need to wear masks? Is the pollution that we're going to be dealing with so serious that we need to worry about that in terms of our training? The Chinese government itself was concerned about that question, that it shut down a fair amount of industrial production and car driving in advance to make sure that the impact was limited. In short, some of the nature of the pollution problems are different in Asia than in other places. The second thing is that it's a region that's full of developing nations. And the impact of the effort to try to restrain the growth of greenhouse gases excuse me, also involves questions about what kind of industrial production and what kind of economic growth is going to be allowed. It's really a question of balancing growth on the one hand with efforts to reduce greenhouse gases on the other. There's a special concern that China has as well. Excuse me, you can tell I still haven't quite gotten over the hay fever. Take a quick break here. China has been arguing all along that it can't bear a disproportionate burden of either the costs of the consequences of greenhouse gases or the cost for reducing greenhouse gases at the same time. Fundamental question there is just how important a role and a player China is to the entire debate, what steps China ought to take, what the implications for Chinese economic development might be if it turns out that the efforts to try to reduce the production of greenhouse gases has some impact on the rate of economic growth, and as the Chinese occasionally have argued, is it fair to put a restraint on Chinese economic growth to keep it from keeping up with the rest of the world in exchange for consequences that will be felt much more broadly? Just what is China's role and what is the set of implications that may influence the Chinese government itself? So what we have is we start looking at the issues of Asia.
If they're using, like if they're making CO2, producing CO2 in industrial processes that are being shipped to the United States, so they're making X boxes for us, does that get factored into their CO2 counting to ours?
Well, that is open for debate because at this point neither the United States nor China have become really full signatories to the full range of issues here. But there's the whole supply chain argument here. And if it turns out that the United States exports its pollution problems to other countries like China, but imports the goods back, how do you try to deal with the questions of climate change and engineering processes that go into that all the way back to supply chain in a global economy? And that's something that's up for grabs, and it's going to be open for argument. And one of the things
European countries do it as is. So if German products being made in somewhere in Eastern Europe, but still within the EU, when they factor in pollution reduction, where does that, or pollution numbers, where is that measured?
Yeah, for the time being now, at least to my understanding, it's at the point of emission.
Okay.
But as you suggest, one of the things that we increasingly have to deal with is the fact that the point of emission may not be the sole element that we need to worry about, because the entire supply chain is part of it. And one of the things, simply in terms of equity, that would be unfair would be for developed countries to export the burden and the cost of compliance to developing countries for producing goods that are then sold back to developed countries. Developing countries, to be sure, get jobs as a result of that, but if developed countries can escape part of the burden of dealing with the consequences of the products they're producing because some of the more polluting sources of production are sent elsewhere, and so the economic costs for dealing with that are exported elsewhere as well, that's a very big issue. So as we start looking at Asia in particular, Asia, given the enormous size of its developing economy, the enormous size of two large economies in particular, China and India, the fact that there are other countries that are developing as well, that there are significant consequences that are being felt in terms of the impact of greenhouse gases and pollution on some of these countries themselves, that they don't want to be told that they need to try to deal with the costs along with everyone else of dealing with greenhouse gases in ways that might restrain their ability to grow, and they don't want to be told, as we've just been discussing, that they're the ones who are going to be responsible for paying the costs and bearing the consequences of the supply chain piece that they're responsible for, and having developed countries export dirty production to them as well as the cost for compliance, what we have here is a very complex environment. Adding to that is one other piece as well, where the countries like Japan and Korea, South Korea in particular, that have been major leaders in the effort to try to deal with the questions of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So the Asian environment and the Asian market itself is extremely complex in addition to that, just in the political and the social and the economic terms. And so the questions that we deal with when we look at the problems of compliance and the problems ultimately of balancing economic growth on the one hand and compliance with a broader global strategy for reducing greenhouse gases find some of the most complex puzzles when we deal with the issues in Asia. And so dealing with some of those questions is what our guest speaker today is going to be dealing with. So I will now turn the podium over to him virtually and electronically. Those of you who are watching on the internet will be able to just click on a link to be able to pull this up. And we're going to be starting about 24 minutes into a much longer, fascinating set of things. We don't have time today to show everything, but we're going to be starting about 24 minutes into that with an introduction and then a discussion about some of the issues that we've been exploring.